The clock had just struck 11:30 p.m. when Dr. Kumar was finally heading home after a grueling 12-hour shift at City General Hospital. The streets were quiet, with only the occasional car passing by under the dim streetlights. He had performed 2 successful heart surgeries that day, and all he could think about was getting home to his warm bed. The gentle hum of his car's engine was suddenly interrupted by the piercing flash of red and blue lights in his rearview mirror. Dr. Kumar checked his speedometer. He hadn't been speeding. With 15 years of driving experience and a spotless record, he wondered what could be wrong as he carefully pulled over to the side of the empty street. His heart sank a little as he watched the police officer approach in his side mirror. There was something about the officer's walk, a certain aggressive stride, that made him uneasy. Dr. Kumar reached for his wallet, making sure to keep his movements slow and visible. The countless news stories and warnings from friends echoed in his mind. The officer's flashlight beam hit his face with unnecessary intensity. "License and registration," the officer demanded, not even bothering with a greeting. His nameplate read Officer P. Wilson, and his face wore a look of predetermined suspicion. "Good evening, officer," Dr. Kumar replied politely, his voice steady despite his growing discomfort. He handed over his documents, carefully explaining, "I'm just heading home from my shift at City General. I'm a cardiac surgeon there." The officer scoffed, his flashlight beam moving skeptically over the interior of the luxury car. "Right," he said, his tone dripping with disbelief. "And I'm the chief of surgery. Step out of the vehicle." Dr. Kumar felt a familiar weight in his chest, the same feeling he'd experienced too many times before. Here he was, wearing his hospital scrubs under his coat, his surgery ID still clipped to his pocket, yet none of it seemed to matter. The prestigious medical degree hanging in his office, the countless lives he'd saved on his operating table, the respect he'd earned from his colleagues, all disappeared in the face of prejudice. "Sir," he tried again, maintaining his composure, "I can show you my hospital ID." "I said step out of the vehicle." The officer's voice rose sharply, his hand moving to rest on his belt. "And keep your hands where I can see them." The cold night air hit Dr. Kumar's face as he carefully stepped out. His mind wandered to the emergency room where, just hours ago, he'd saved the life of a retired police officer. He wondered if Officer Wilson would believe that story either. "Is there a problem with my driving, officer?" he asked calmly, standing perfectly still as the officer circled him like a predator. "How does someone like you afford a car like this?" Officer Wilson questioned, ignoring Dr. Kumar's inquiry. He ran his hand along the car's expensive finish, as if searching for evidence of some imagined crime. The question stung, but Dr. Kumar had learned long ago that dignity often meant staying calm in the face of indignity. He thought about his patients, people from all walks of life who trusted him with their hearts, never questioning his credentials or character when they lay vulnerable on his operating table. "I worked hard for everything I have, officer," he replied quietly, watching as Officer Wilson began an unnecessary search of his car. 12 years of medical training, thousands of surgeries. The officer continued his search, muttering under his breath about checking for drugs and suspicious vehicles in the area. Dr. Kumar stood in the chilly night air, his surgical cap still in his coat pocket, his hands visible at his sides, and his heart heavy with a different kind of tiredness than what he'd felt leaving the hospital. Little did either of them know that in just a few minutes, this encounter would take a dramatic turn, one that would challenge everything Officer Wilson thought he knew about the man he was so eagerly trying to humiliate. As Officer Wilson finished searching the car's trunk, he waved the flashlight beam directly into Dr. Kumar's eyes again. The cold wind had picked up, but that wasn't why Dr. Kumar felt a chill run through his body. 20 minutes had passed since he'd been pulled over, and each minute felt longer than the last. "Pop open the glove compartment," Officer Wilson commanded, his voice carrying the same harsh edge. Dr. Kumar complied, knowing what he'd find. Just the car manual, insurance papers, and a small first aid kit he always kept handy. The officer pulled out each item, examining them with exaggerated suspicion. When he came across Dr. Kumar's hospital parking permit, he held it up with a smirk. "Pretty good fake ID setup you've got here. Must have cost a pretty penny." Dr. Kumar took a deep breath, the way he did before complicated surgeries. "Officer, that's my legitimate hospital ID. You can call the hospital to verify. I just finished operating on." "Save your stories." Officer Wilson cut him off, dropping the papers carelessly on the passenger seat. "You know how many times I've heard creative explanations. Let me guess. You're also friends with the hospital director." Actually, he was. They'd worked together for 8 years, saved countless lives side by side. But Dr. Kumar knew mentioning that would only make things worse. Instead, he watched silently as Officer Wilson ran his fingers along the car's leather seats, as if expecting to find hidden compartments or evidence of wrongdoing. "My shift ended at 11, Dr. Kumar explained patiently, his surgical watch showing it was now nearly midnight. "I have another operation scheduled for tomorrow morning at 7. If there's no problem with my driving, I'd really need to." "Oh, you're in a hurry now." Officer Wilson's tone turned mockingly sweet. "That's funny, because I've got all night. In fact, I think we should wait for the K-9 unit to come take a look." Dr. Kumar's shoulders slumped slightly. He thought about his young daughter, probably still awake waiting for him to come home and read her favorite bedtime story, as he'd promised this morning. He thought about his wife, who would be worried by now but knew better than to call, not during situations like this. The officer walked back to his patrol car, deliberately taking his time as he radioed in. Dr. Kumar could hear him describing the situation. Suspicious individual, uncooperative, possible stolen vehicle. Each word felt like a small cut, the kind that doesn't bleed much but stings sharply. Here he was, standing in his surgical scrubs, his hands, the same hands that had held beating hearts earlier that day, raised slightly at his sides to stay visible. A passing car slowed down, the driver clearly curious about the scene. Dr. Kumar turned his face away, knowing that tomorrow he might see that same person in his clinic, perhaps trusting him with their life, never knowing they had witnessed his humiliation. Officer Wilson returned, flipping through his ticket book with theatrical slowness. "So tell me again about this doctor story of yours. Must be nice, playing dress-up. Those scrubs probably came from a costume shop, right?" The irony wasn't lost on Dr. Kumar. Just that afternoon, he'd given a lecture to medical students about staying calm under pressure. When someone's heart is in your hands, he told them, your own emotions have to take a backseat. He never imagined he'd be applying that lesson like this. The officer began writing a ticket, muttering comments just loud enough to be heard. People these days, thinking they can fool anyone, probably borrowed the car for the night. Dr. Kumar looked up at the stars, the same ones he'd sometimes see when leaving the hospital after long surgeries. He thought about all the lives he helped save, people of all backgrounds, beliefs, and yes, even their prejudices. In the operating room, none of that mattered. A heart was a heart, a life was a life. Little did he know that in the next few moments, these same principles would be put to the ultimate test, as fate was about to take an unexpected turn that would challenge both men's understanding of humanity. Standing in the cold night air, Dr. Kumar's mind drifted to earlier that day. He had spent 6 hours in surgery, saving an elderly man who everyone else had given up on. Too risky, they'd said. But Dr. Kumar had seen the man's family, his grandchildren clutching their homemade get-well cards, his wife of 50 years holding his hand before the surgery. He couldn't give up on them. Now, as Officer Wilson continued his baseless harassment, Dr. Kumar felt a storm of emotions building inside him. The frustration wasn't new. He'd faced similar situations before, though usually not this intense. 25 years ago, his father had sat him down and explained how the world sometimes works. "Beta," he had said, using the Hindi word for son. Your skills and knowledge will earn you respect in the hospital, but the moment you step outside, some people will only see what they want to see. His father's words echoed in his mind as Officer Wilson made another snide comment about his story. The same hands that had delicately repaired a damaged heart this morning were now trembling slightly, not from fear, but from the effort of containing his anger. A memory flashed through his mind. Last week, a young patient had asked him why he became a doctor. "I'd wanted to help people," he had answered simply. "When someone's on my operating table, nothing else matters, not their background, not their beliefs, not even how they might have treated me outside the hospital." The cruel irony of his current situation wasn't lost on him. Just 3 months ago, he had operated on a police officer's wife. The officer had hugged him afterward, tears streaming down his face, calling him a guardian angel. Dr. Kumar wondered what that officer would think if he saw this scene now. His phone buzzed in his pocket, probably his wife wondering why he wasn't home yet. He didn't dare reach for it. Instead, he focused on his breathing, just like he taught his stressed patients. In, out, stay calm, stay professional, stay alive. The sound of Officer Wilson writing the ticket seemed unnaturally loud in the quiet night. Dr. Kumar thought about his morning schedule. A triple bypass on a kindergarten teacher. Her students had made her a huge get-well card with hundreds of tiny handprints. It was hanging in her room right now, waiting for her to wake up and see it after the surgery. Would he even make it to that surgery? At this rate, with Officer Wilson talking about calling for additional units, he might be standing here all night. His patients needed him. That teacher's students needed her. But right now, none of that seemed to matter to the man with the badge and flashlight. Dr. Kumar closed his eyes for a moment, remembering something his mother always said. "Beta, your reaction to bad behavior says more about you than their behavior says about them." She had survived partition, crossed borders with nothing but her dignity intact. Sometimes, she'd tell him, maintaining your dignity is itself a victory. The weight of his hospital ID still hung around his neck. 12 years of medical school, thousands of successful surgeries, countless lives saved, all reduced to nothing in the eyes of someone who chose to see him as a suspect rather than a surgeon. The irony was almost painful. In his operating room, he had saved people who probably shared Officer Wilson's prejudices. A car drove past slowly, its headlights illuminating the scene. Dr. Kumar wondered if they saw what Officer Wilson saw, a suspicious character being rightfully questioned. Or did they see the truth? A tired doctor in scrubs, being harassed after saving lives all day. He thought about his daughter, who wanted to become a doctor like her papa. What would he tell her about tonight? How would he explain that excellence isn't always enough, that some battles aren't fought with scalpels and sutures? The wind picked up again, carrying the distant sound of sirens from the hospital he'd left less than an hour ago. Another life hanging in the balance, another family waiting anxiously in those cold corridors. Meanwhile, here he stood, unable to help anyone, watching Officer Wilson take his time with that ticket book. None of them could have known that fate was about to teach them both a lesson in humanity, one that no medical school or police academy could ever prepare them for. The night air had grown colder, and Officer Wilson was just finishing up with his ticket book when it happened. At first, it was subtle. The officer's hand moved slightly to his chest, a small gesture that most people would miss. But Dr. Kumar noticed. Years of watching patients had trained his eyes to catch these tiny signs. The officer's face changed ever so slightly. A twitch of discomfort crossed his features as he tried to maintain his authoritative stance. The ticket book trembled slightly in his hand, not from the cold, but from something else. Dr. Kumar recognized these signs immediately. He'd seen them hundreds of times before. "Officer," Dr. Kumar's voice had changed completely. Gone was the defensive tone of someone being harassed. In its place was the calm, professional voice of a doctor who had seen these symptoms far too often. "Are you feeling any chest pain?" Officer Wilson tried to ignore him, attempting to maintain his tough demeanor. "I'm not done with you, E." His words cut off as he winced, the pain clearly intensifying. The ticket book slipped from his fingers, landing softly on the wet pavement. "Sir, please let me help you," Dr. Kumar said, taking a careful step forward. His medical training was kicking in, overriding everything else that had happened in the last 30 minutes. "I need you to tell me exactly what you're feeling." The officer's breathing had become labored, and sweat was beading on his forehead despite the cold. His right hand was now clutching his chest more obviously, his knuckles white with tension. Pride and fear battled on his face as he looked at the man he'd been humiliating just moments ago. "I'm fine," Officer Wilson managed to say, but his legs were starting to buckle. He reached for his patrol car to steady himself, but his coordination was failing. The same hand that had held the flashlight so steadily in Dr. Kumar's face now shook uncontrollably. Dr. Kumar's world narrowed to what was directly in front of him, a patient in distress. It didn't matter that this same man had spent the last half hour treating him like a criminal. Right now, all that mattered were the medical symptoms he was witnessing, the classic signs of a severe cardiac event. The officer took one stumbling step and started to fall. Without hesitation, Dr. Kumar moved forward to catch him. The same hands that Officer Wilson had viewed with suspicion now prevented his head from hitting the pavement. The doctor's movements were swift and sure, guided by years of experience rather than the emotions of the past 30 minutes. "I need you to listen to me very carefully," Dr. Kumar said firmly, helping the officer into a sitting position against the patrol car. "You're having a cardiac event. I'm going to help you, but you need to trust me right now. Can you do that?" Officer Wilson's eyes were wide with fear now, the kind of fear Dr. Kumar had seen in countless patients' eyes. The kind that makes all prejudices disappear in the face of mortality. The officer managed a weak nod, his breath coming in short, painful gasps. The police radio had fallen from the officer's belt when he stumbled. Dr. Kumar reached for it, knowing every second counted. The same radio that had been used to report him as a suspicious person would now be used to save its owner's life. "This is a medical emergency," Dr. Kumar spoke clearly into the radio, his voice carrying the authority that came from years of handling life and death situations. "Officer down at." He glanced at the street sign, giving the exact location. "Requesting immediate medical assistance. Possible cardiac event in progress." The night that had started with suspicion and prejudice had suddenly transformed into something entirely different. As Dr. Kumar began his initial assessment of the officer's condition, he couldn't help but note the irony. The very skills that Officer Wilson had doubted minutes ago were now the only thing standing between him and disaster. None of the earlier harassment mattered now. In this moment, there was only a doctor and his patient, and a race against time that would test both men's understanding of humanity. Time seemed to stand still as Dr. Kumar knelt beside Officer Wilson. In the emergency room, he'd have a whole team, expensive machines, and every tool at his disposal. Here, on this dark street, he had nothing but his knowledge and his hands. The same hands that the officer had viewed with suspicion just moments ago. The world narrowed down to this one critical moment. Officer Wilson's breathing was becoming more labored, his skin taking on a grayish tinge that Dr. Kumar had seen too many times before. His own heart was racing, but for entirely different reasons now. This wasn't about hurt pride or unfair treatment anymore. This was about life and death. For a split second, a small voice in the back of his mind whispered, "Just walk away. After how he treated you, why help?" Dr. Kumar pushed that thought aside immediately. It went against everything he believed in, everything he'd worked for. He remembered telling his students just last week, when someone's life is in your hands, their past doesn't matter. Their actions don't matter. All that matters is saving them. "Officer, I need you to focus on my voice, Dr. Kumar said firmly, checking the officer's pulse. It was rapid and irregular, another bad sign. Can you rate your chest pain on a scale of 1 to 10? Officer Wilson tried to speak, but only managed to hold up 7 fingers. His eyes, which had been full of suspicion earlier, now showed something else. Raw fear. The kind of fear that strips away all pretenses, all prejudices, leaving only human vulnerability. Dr. Kumar quickly ran through his mental checklist. The symptoms were clear: severe chest pain, shortness of breath, cold sweats, irregular pulse. Classic signs of a major heart attack. Without proper medical intervention, the officer had minutes, maybe less. He could hear sirens in the distance, but they sounded too far away. Every second counted now. Dr. Kumar had to make a choice: wait for the ambulance and risk losing valuable time, or take immediate action with his limited resources. The officer's eyes began to roll back slightly. Dr. Kumar squeezed his shoulder hard. "Stay with me," he commanded, using the same authoritative voice he used in the operating room. "Look at me. Focused on my face." A passing car slowed down, probably curious about the scene. A man in scrubs kneeling next to a police officer slumped against his patrol car. How quickly things had changed. Just minutes ago, that same passing car might have seen what looked like another routine traffic stop, another example of profiling. Dr. Kumar reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small bottle of aspirin he always carried. A habit from his early days as an intern. "Can you swallow?" he asked the officer, who managed a weak nod. "Listen to me carefully," Dr. Kumar said, his voice steady despite the gravity of the situation. "You're having a heart attack. I'm going to help you, but I need you to trust me completely. Can you do that?" The irony of asking for trust from someone who had shown him none wasn't lost on him. But there was no time for such thoughts. The officer's life hung by a thread, and that thread was in Dr. Kumar's hands. The sirens were getting closer, but still not close enough. Officer Wilson's grip on Dr. Kumar's arm was weakening. The doctor had to make a decision right now, one that would test not just his medical skills, but his humanity. In his 20 years of practice, Dr. Kumar had faced many critical moments. But this one was different. This wasn't just about saving a life. It was about choosing to rise above prejudice, about proving that humanity transcends bias and discrimination. As he prepared to take action, Dr. Kumar thought about his father's words from years ago. "Sometimes, beta, the greatest victory is not in proving others wrong, but in proving yourself right." The next few minutes would put those words to the ultimate test. Without wasting another second, Dr. Kumar sprang into action. Years of emergency response training took over as he loosened the officer's tight collar and positioned him properly against the patrol car. The irony wasn't lost on him. The same hands that Officer Wilson had ordered to stay visible were now working to save his life. "Chew this aspirin," Dr. Kumar instructed firmly, his voice carrying the authority of countless emergency situations. "Don't swallow it whole. Let it dissolve." He supported the officer's trembling hand as he guided the medicine to his mouth. Every movement was precise, every second precious. The police radio crackled with responses to his earlier call for help, but the voices seemed distant compared to the sound of Officer Wilson's labored breathing. Dr. Kumar grabbed the radio again. "This is Dr. Kumar at the scene. Patient is experiencing an acute myocardial infarction. We need that ambulance here now." A small crowd had begun to gather at a distance. Dr. Kumar could hear their whispers, see their phones recording the scene. How quickly things had changed, from being treated as a suspect to becoming someone's only hope for survival. But he pushed those thoughts aside. Right now, nothing mattered except the life hanging in the balance. "Stay with me," Dr. Kumar commanded as Officer Wilson's eyes started to flutter. He began chest compressions, knowing they might be necessary at any moment. The officer's skin was clammy, his breathing increasingly shallow. Tell me about your family, he urged, trying to keep the officer conscious and engaged. Do you have children? Officer Wilson managed to nod weakly, holding up 2 fingers. T2 girls, he gasped. Focus on them, Dr. Kumar instructed, checking the officer's pulse again. Think about their faces. Think about going home to them. The same man who had doubted his identity as a doctor was now clutching his arm like a lifeline. The sound of approaching sirens grew louder, but Dr. Kumar knew they weren't out of danger yet. He continued monitoring vital signs, his trained eye catching every subtle change in the officer's condition. The medical terminology running through his mind was extensive, but he kept his instructions simple and clear. You're doing great, he encouraged, even as he noticed the officer's pulse growing weaker. Help is almost here. Just keep breathing with me. In and out. That's it. A bead of sweat rolled down Dr. Kumar's forehead, despite the cold night air. He performed countless procedures in high-pressure situations, but this was different. This wasn't the sterile environment of his operating room. This was a dark street, with only his knowledge and determination standing between a man and death. The same flashlight that had been shown in his face earlier now lay on the ground, its beam creating long shadows. Dr. Kumar used it to check the officer's pupils, noting their response. Every detail mattered. Every observation could be crucial for the paramedics when they arrived. I'm sorry, Officer Wilson whispered suddenly, his voice barely audible. I shouldn't have. Save your strength, Dr. Kumar cut him off gently. We can talk about that later. Right now, focus on staying awake. Tell me more about your daughters. What are their favorite subjects in school? The distant sirens were getting closer, their wailing cutting through the night air. Dr. Kumar could finally see the flashing lights approaching. But he didn't let his attention waver from his patient for even a second. He'd learned long ago that the final moments before help arrives can be the most critical. In these intense minutes, all the barriers that had existed between them, race, prejudice, suspicion, had melted away. There was only a doctor and his patient, locked in humanity's most basic struggle, the fight for survival. The ambulance was almost there, but this night was far from over. The real test of both men's character was just beginning. The ambulance screeched to a halt, its red and blue lights painting the street in alternating colors. Dr. Kumar didn't look up from his patient as the paramedics rushed toward them. His hands remained steady, his focus unwavering, as he continued monitoring Officer Wilson's vital signs. Suspected myocardial infarction, Dr. Kumar reported crisply as the paramedics reached them. Pain began approximately 8 minutes ago. I've administered aspirin. Pulse is weak and irregular, breathing labored. He spoke with a precise clarity that came from years of emergency room experience. The paramedics worked quickly, their movements efficient and practiced. One of them glanced at Dr. Kumar's scrubs, then at Officer Wilson's uniform, clearly trying to piece together the strange scene before them. But there was no time for explanations. BP is dropping, one paramedic called out as they attached their monitoring equipment. Dr. Kumar helped them position Officer Wilson onto the stretcher, his hands just as steady as theirs. The same hands that had been ordered against a car in suspicion were now helping guide life-saving equipment into place. I'm coming with you, Dr. Kumar said firmly as they prepared to load the stretcher into the ambulance. It wasn't a request. His tone carried the authority of someone used to making life and death decisions. The lead paramedic nodded quickly, recognizing the value of having a doctor on board. Inside the ambulance, the space was tight but familiar. Dr. Kumar had been in similar situations countless times, though usually on the receiving end at the hospital. The irony wasn't lost on him. Just 30 minutes ago, Officer Wilson had been threatening to call for backup to investigate him. Now he was part of the backup fighting to save the officer's life. Stay with us, Dr. Kumar commanded as Officer Wilson's eyes began to flutter again. The monitors beeped urgently, their electronic warnings adding to the tension in the confined space. Think about your daughters. Think about seeing them graduate, walking them down the aisle one day. The paramedics worked around him, their movements choreographed by years of experience. Dr. Kumar called out vital signs and observations, his voice remaining steady even as the situation grew more critical. Each bump in the road was a reminder of how precarious their patient's condition was. 2 minutes out, the driver called back. Dr. Kumar could feel the ambulance accelerating, its siren cutting through the night. He maintained constant contact with Officer Wilson, both physically and verbally, refusing to let him slip away. "Your daughters need you," he said firmly, watching the monitor's irregular patterns. "Your community needs you. Stay with us." The words felt strange in his mouth. Just a short while ago, this same man had made him feel unwelcome in that very community. The ambulance radio crackled with updates to the emergency room. Dr. Kumar added his own observations, knowing they would help the waiting team prepare. Every detail could make a difference. Every second counted. "Almost there," he assured Officer Wilson, whose grip on consciousness was growing weaker. The officer's eyes found his, and in them, Dr. Kumar saw something new. Not the suspicion from earlier, but a raw, human vulnerability. A look that stripped away all barriers of rank and race, leaving only the basic human need to survive. The hospital's emergency entrance came into view, its bright lights a beacon in the darkness. The waiting medical team rushed forward as the ambulance doors burst open. Dr. Kumar delivered a rapid, precise report of the patient's condition and treatment so far. As they wheeled Officer Wilson through the familiar corridors, Dr. Kumar kept pace, his hand still on the stretcher. The same hallways he'd walked through countless times as a respected surgeon now witnessed a different kind of journey, one that transcended professional roles and social prejudices. The emergency room doors loomed ahead, and Dr. Kumar knew the next few hours would be critical. The night that had started with discrimination was now becoming a powerful lesson in humanity, though its final chapter was yet to be written. The emergency room burst into activity as Officer Wilson was rushed through the doors. Dr. Kumar quickly switched roles from roadside savior to professional consultant, briefing the attending medical team. The same voice that had been defending himself during a traffic stop was now confidently directing life-saving procedures. "Get me an ECG stat," he ordered, his tone carrying the weight of authority that came naturally in these halls. The staff responded immediately. Here, they knew him as the skilled cardiac surgeon who had saved countless lives, not as the man who'd been profiled on a dark street. 2 young girls burst into the emergency room, followed by a worried woman who could only be Officer Wilson's wife. Their faces were etched with fear and confusion. Dr. Kumar watched as their eyes darted between their father on the stretcher and the medical team working frantically around him. "Are you the doctor?" the older daughter asked, her voice trembling. She couldn't have been more than 15. "Please save our dad." The younger one clutched her sister's hand, tears streaming down her face. These were the daughters Officer Wilson had managed to tell them about, the ones he'd used to keep him conscious during those critical minutes. Dr. Kumar felt his throat tighten. "We're doing everything we can," he assured them, his voice gentle but confident. He didn't mention the traffic stop, the harassment, or the suspicious glances. None of that mattered now. "Your father is in good hands." The ECG results came in, confirming what Dr. Kumar had suspected on the street. A serious heart attack requiring immediate surgery. As the leading cardiac surgeon on call, he would be the one operating. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on the emergency room staff, who had heard snippets of the story from the paramedics. "Mrs. Wilson," Dr. Kumar addressed the officer's wife, who stood trembling beside her daughters. "Your husband needs emergency bypass surgery. I'll be performing the operation myself." He explained the procedure in simple, clear terms, the way he always did with patients' families. "But before we start," he continued, pulling out a consent form, "I need your signature. I want you to know that I'll be giving your husband the same care I give all my patients, the absolute best." Mrs. Wilson looked at him, really looked at him, and something in her expression suggested she'd heard about what happened during the traffic stop. Her hands shook as she took the pen, but her voice was steady. "Please," she whispered, "just save him." The operating room was being prepared as Dr. Kumar scrubbed in. Through the window, he could see the two girls hugging their mother in the waiting area. The same waiting area where, countless times before, he had seen families of all backgrounds united by the same fear and hope. His surgical team worked with practiced efficiency, every person knowing their role. As he tied his surgical mask, Dr. Kumar caught his reflection in the steel cabinet. The same face that had been illuminated by a suspicious flashlight just hours ago was now hidden behind a surgical mask, ready to save the life of the man who had doubted him. "Scalpel," he called out, his hand steady as it had been thousands of times before. The familiar weight of the instrument grounded him. In this room, there were no prejudices, no assumptions, no discrimination. There was only the steady beeping of monitors, the focused concentration of his team, and the precious life beneath his skilled hands. As he made the first incision, Dr. Kumar thought about how quickly life could change. Just hours ago, Officer Wilson had looked at these same hands with suspicion. Now these hands held his heart, literally and figuratively. The surgery would take hours, and success wasn't guaranteed. But in this moment, as the operating room lights shone down and his team waited for his next command, Dr. Kumar knew that this night would change more than just one man's heart. 3 days after the surgery, Officer Wilson opened his eyes to find himself in the recovery room. The steady beeping of monitors had replaced the frantic sirens of that fateful night. Sunlight streamed through the window, casting a warm glow on the get-well cards his daughters had decorated with hearts and glitter. His first clear memory was of Dr. Kumar standing by his bedside during morning rounds, checking his vitals with the same careful attention he'd shown on that dark street. The doctor's hands moved with precise confidence, the same hands he had once viewed with unwarranted suspicion. "How are you feeling?" Dr. Kumar asked, his voice carrying the same professional warmth he showed all his patients. There was no trace of resentment, no hint of the humiliation he'd faced during that traffic stop. Officer Wilson's voice was weak, but his words carried the weight of profound realization. "You saved my life," he said, "after I treated you like—" His voice cracked, unable to finish the sentence. "What matters is that you're recovering well," Dr. Kumar replied simply, making notes in the chart. "Your family needs you. Your community needs you." These were the same words he used to keep the officer fighting during those critical moments. That afternoon, Officer Wilson's police chief came to visit. The story had spread through the department, becoming a powerful reminder of the consequences of prejudice and the true meaning of service. The chief had already initiated an internal review of their practices, using this incident as a catalyst for change. "I want to make this right," Officer Wilson told Dr. Kumar during evening rounds. His daughters sat beside him, holding his hands, their eyes moving between their father and the man who had saved him. Not just with words, but with actions. Over the next few weeks, as Officer Wilson recovered, he did exactly that. From his hospital bed, he began writing a detailed account of that night. Not just what happened, but what he learned. His story became part of the Police Academy's training program, a first-hand testament to the cost of prejudice and the power of professional duty. Dr. Kumar continued his daily rounds, treating Officer Wilson just as he treated all his patients, with skill, respect, and compassion. Each visit was a quiet reminder that true character isn't revealed in how we treat those who look like us, but in how we treat those who don't. The day Officer Wilson was discharged, he stood shakily but proudly in the hospital lobby. Many of his fellow officers had gathered, along with hospital staff who had heard the story. His daughters held a handmade thank you card, covered in the kind of glitter that would take weeks to clean up. "I've spent 20 years as a police officer," he addressed the gathered crowd, his voice strong despite his recent surgery. "But I never really understood what it meant to protect and serve until I experienced what true service looks like. Dr. Kumar didn't just save my life. He showed me what it means to rise above prejudice and do what's right. Dr. Kumar stood quietly at the back of the lobby, listening. He thought about all the lives he'd saved over the years, but this felt different. This time, he hadn't just repaired a heart, he had helped transform one. In the months that followed, Officer Wilson became an advocate for change within the police force. He shared his story at training sessions, community meetings, and police academies across the state. His experience became a powerful testament to the importance of looking beyond appearances and treating everyone with dignity and respect. As for Dr. Kumar, he continued his work as always, saving lives regardless of who lay on his operating table. But sometimes, when new patients arrived with anxiety or prejudice in their eyes, he would think of that night and smile quietly to himself. Because he knew that sometimes the greatest healing happens not in the heart that's operated on, but in the heart that learns to see differently. The traffic stop that began with prejudice had become a story of transformation, a reminder that sometimes the most powerful changes come not from grand gestures, but from simple moments of humanity, when we choose to rise above our biases and see the person behind our preconceptions.